Lucid dreaming is supposed to give you control. You're awake inside the dream, aware it isn't real, free to shape it however you want. But consciousness was never meant to exist in that space. And when you open your eyes somewhere you were supposed to stay unconscious for. Sometimes you bring the door with you. This is the Nightmare Index, real documented horror from the world we're already living in. If you're ready to make sure you don't miss what comes next, subscribe and turn on notifications now. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? It helps to know you're not alone while listening to this. Let's begin. I spent 6 weeks teaching myself how to notice a dream from the inside. The first night it finally worked. The problem was not getting into the dream. The problem was how many times I woke up in my own room before I understood the room could not be trusted either. At 3:17 in the morning, I was sitting upright in bed, staring at the brass chain above my apartment door, trying to remember whether I had latched it before I slept or after I came back in. The red digits on the clock beside me looked steady. The top segment on the last number was still missing, the same way it had been missing since I bought it from a thrift shelf downstairs, which meant any 8 looked like a 3. I kept checking that broken line because it was the one thing that had stayed the same through every awakening. How many times can a person wake up before the word means nothing? That night started quietly, which was part of the reason it got as far as it did. I was living alone then, in a studio apartment above a laundromat at the end of a strip of closed storefronts. During the day, the whole place smelled faintly of hot metal and detergent. At night, when the machines below were still running, the floor held a low heat, and the air near the vent by my bed carried that warm dryer sheet smell up into the room. I had been there long enough to know every small sound that belonged there, the click in the pipes when the unit next to mine used water, the soft rattle in the window frame when buses turned at the corner, the way the old lock on my door resisted for half a second before catching. The brass chain above it was newer than the rest. I always set it before bed. I liked the small metal drag of it, the neat habit of it, the feeling that one exact movement closed the day. Lucid dreaming had started for me as something that looked harmless from the outside. A skill, a trick. I had been sleeping badly for a while. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of broken sleep that leaves the inside of your head feeling unfinished by noon. I kept reading the same advice in the same places. Keep a dream journal. Interrupt your sleep on purpose. Wake after 4 or 5 hours, stay up for a little while, then go back down with an intention already waiting. Reality checks during the day, so your brain carries the habit into sleep. Look at a clock twice, read a line twice, count your fingers. If the world shifts under inspection, you are dreaming. Once you know that, you can control where the dream goes. It sounded clean on paper. So I built the routine exactly the way the guide said to. Notebook on the dresser beside the bed, pen uncapped. Water glass on top of a paperback so I would hear it if I reached for the notebook in the dark. Phone alarm set for 2:40 a.m. with the sound turned low enough not to tear me awake. A short sentence written on the first line of a fresh page before sleep. Next time I dream, I will notice the clock. That night was a Thursday in late October. It had rained earlier. The window was cracked just enough to let in the smell of wet pavement from the alley behind the building, mixing strangely with the detergent heat rising from below. I remember feeling almost pleased with the setup. That was the mood. Not tense, not reckless, just patient, like I was finally going to get a result after doing the same small thing long enough. I went to sleep a little after 11. When the alarm touched off at 2:40, I sat up at once. The room looked ordinary, flat with dark. The red clock numbers smeared in my half-open eyes until I blinked them into shape. I drank some of the water, enough to cool my throat, and wrote in the notebook without turning on the lamp. Awake. Intention set, door chained. Then I got up, used the bathroom, stood at the sink long enough to feel the tile chill through my feet, and came back to bed. I remember looking at the chain before I lay down. I remember the exact angle of it, slack between the 2 brass points. I remember thinking that it was good to anchor myself to one visible fact. Before I went under again, I lay on my back and repeated the sentence in my head until it thinned out and stopped sounding like language. The first dream was almost insulting in how obvious it became. I was in my apartment, except the shape of it was wrong. The studio was only 1 room and a bathroom, but in the dream there was a narrow, extra passage beyond the kitchenette, a dim strip of space that should not have existed. I walked into it and came back into the same room from a different angle. as if the apartment had folded through itself. I looked at the clock by the bed because I had trained myself to do that. It said 3:88. I looked away. I looked back. It said 7:13, then 0:71. That was enough. I felt that sudden internal drop, not from height, but from certainty giving way. This is it, I thought. I know what this is. The guides had all said the same thing. Don't get too excited. Stabilize, rub your hands together, look at details. Stay calm, so I did. I rubbed my fingertips against each other and felt the friction sharpen. I looked at the seam in the curtain. I touched the dresser and felt the fake wood grain under my palm. Everything became clearer instead of breaking apart. That part felt almost beautiful. I was asleep and knew it, and the dream had not thrown me out. For a few seconds, I understood why people chase that feeling. Then I decided I wanted to wake up and write it down before I forgot it. Another technique I had read was simple. Close your eyes in the dream and fall backward, or tell yourself to wake. So I did both. I shut my eyes. I felt the sensation of dropping, gentle at first, then clean and immediate, like the bed had opened beneath me. I woke up in the dark, in my own bed. In my own room. That should have been the end of it. My heart was moving hard, not fast exactly, but heavy enough that I could feel each beat in the back of my neck against the pillow. I reached for the notebook on the dresser, switched on the lamp and saw that it was already open. One word was written across the page. Worked. I stood there for a second with the pen in my hand, looking at that word. The handwriting looked like mine because it was mine. The slant was mine. The pressure in the downstroke was mine. I tried to remember writing it and could not. Then I did what people do when something small arrives wearing the wrong shape. I explained it away before the silence around it had time to deepen. I must have written it half asleep after the alarm. I must have forgotten. I added another line below it. First lucid dream. Clock unstable. Fell backward to wake. I drank the rest of the water, turned off the lamp, and lay down again with the notebook still open. The next awakening came quicker. I was in bed. The room was dark. The clock said 3:17. The dryer sheet smell from below was gone. That detail reached me before the rest. The vent near my bed always carried that smell at night. It was part of the building, part of the room. The air now was colder and flat, with none of that warm chemical sweetness in it. I lay there and stared toward the vent, telling myself it probably just meant the machines downstairs had stopped. I counted my fingers in the red dark. One hand looked right. The other took too long. I had to touch each finger with the opposite thumb to be sure. 5. Fine. Awake then, I sat up. The notebook on the dresser was closed now, with the pen placed across it horizontally, exactly straight. I had not left it like that. I was sure of it because I never placed anything that neatly. I went over, opened it, and found a new line under the one I remembered writing. Check the chain first. I did not like the cold that moved through me when I read that, but I still kept it in the realm of the explainable. Half sleep, automatic writing, a habit I did not remember. I turned and looked at the door. The chain was hanging loose. For a second, I simply stared at it, trying to fit the sight to the memory I had of setting it after the 2:40 alarm. Then I crossed the room and touched it. The brass felt cool. I hooked it into place, watched it catch, and stood there with my fingers on the wood a little longer than I needed to. My mouth had gone dry again, although I had finished the water only a few minutes earlier. I looked back at the bed and had the strange thought that lying down inside a room you no longer fully accepted as real was a very different action from lying down inside a room you trusted. The mattress had become a decision. Still, I told myself, lucid dreams can produce false awakenings. That was part of it. People wake inside dreams of their own bedrooms all the time. The trick is to test reality calmly and keep going until something holds. So I went back to bed and decided to test harder. I must have fallen asleep, because the next time I opened my eyes, the lamp was on. I had no memory of switching it on. The red clock still read 3:17. The broken segment on the last digit still made the number look half finished. The notebook was open again. This time there were 3 lines on the page. Clock means nothing. Door first. Do not drink the water. The glass on top of the paperback was full again. I do not mean fuller than before. I mean full, clear to the rim, as if the room had reset the level while I was not looking. I stood up too fast and had to brace one hand on the wall while the blood shifted in my head. My calves were tight as if I had been standing for a long time. There was a faint metallic taste on my tongue. I looked down at my fingers and saw a dark streak near the side of my thumb, a soft gray smear. I rubbed it with spit and it thinned into blackened brass dust, chain residue. I went to the door without thinking, and before I touched it, I knew what I was going to find. The chain was loose again. This time I did not relatch it right away. I just stood there with my hand hovering, the chain dangling at eye level, and felt a hard pressure gathering behind my ribs. Not a rush, not a spike. Something slower, heavier. I was losing the clean line between a dream I remembered and actions I had actually taken with my body. That line had been the whole point of the practice. You go into the dream consciously, you come back out consciously. You prove to yourself that the waking world is the stable one. The problem was that I had trained myself so well to mistrust my first impression of reality that every genuine clue now arrived already weakened. I needed something external, something the next awakening could not quietly rewrite. So I took my phone off the charger, opened the voice memo app, and hit record. I said the date. I said the time showing on the clock. I described the room exactly as I saw it. One bed, one dresser, one chair with laundry on it, sink to the left, door chained now, I said. If I wake again and this file exists, listen before doing anything else. Then I placed the phone on the dresser and lay back down without turning off the lamp. I do not know how long I slept. When I woke again, the lamp was off, the phone was in my hand, and the voice memo had stopped at 19 minutes. There was another file below it, created 3 minutes later. I had not made it unless I had. I pressed play. For the first few seconds, I heard what I expected. My own voice. Flatter because phone recordings always strip some part of you away, listing the room. Then a gap. Then fabric moving. Not a struggle. Just bed linen shifting under weight. A long, quiet stretch. Then my own voice again, lower now, saying words I had no memory of speaking. Don't trust the first room. A pause. If the detergent smell is gone, do not stand up yet. Another pause. If the chain is loose, you already did it. The file ended there. I stood motionless beside the bed with the phone pressed so hard to my ear that the speaker edge hurt. The room around me looked normal in exactly the way a copied thing can look normal if the copy is careful enough. Same chair. Same stack of folded shirts. Same hairline crack in the paint above the kitchenette. Same broken segment in the clock. The only detail I could not place was the air. The laundromat smell below was missing again. I do not know what expression I had on my face in that moment. I only know the muscles around my jaw had locked so tightly they ached. I played the second file. This one began with nothing but room tone, the tiny electrical hum of the lamp and the clock. Then I heard the mattress give once, close to the phone. Then my own voice, close enough to the microphone that it should have meant my mouth was only inches from it. You keep choosing the bed. The rest came softer, as if I had turned away from the phone while speaking. Door, chain, hall. The file ended. I looked down and realized my feet were dirty along the sides, a gray-black film along the arches and heels like hallway dust, not apartment dust. The hall outside my place had unfinished concrete near the stairwell where they had chipped old tile and never replaced it. I knew the feel of that grit. I stood there in the center of the room with the phone in one hand and the brass chain mark darkening my thumb, and I understood the shape of what was happening before I had any proof large enough to hold on to. I was going to sleep. I was becoming lucid. I was false awakening into copies of my room, and somewhere inside the spaces between those copies, my actual body was getting out of bed and walking. If you had taught yourself for weeks to distrust the first version of every room, and you woke with your throat dry, your calves locked, brass dust under your thumb, dirt from the hallway on your feet, and instructions in your own voice telling you what not to trust, would you climb back into the bed because it was the only object that kept appearing, or would you stay standing in that apartment and admit that whatever was moving while you believed you were still dreaming had already learned how to? Use your hands? I stayed standing. Then I made the worst useful decision available to me. I chose proof over comfort. I set the phone to video and wedged it against a mug on the dresser so the camera faced the bed, the clock, and the door in the same frame. I checked the battery, 82%. I brought the chair under the doorknob and set it there, not because I believed a chair would stop me if I decided to move in my sleep, but because I needed one more visible thing the room could not quietly change without leaving a shape behind. I hooked the chain into place and touched it twice. I slid the notebook beneath the empty water glass so that lifting either one would disturb the other. Then I turned on the lamp, lay flat on my back on top of the blanket, and kept my eyes on the cracked patch of ceiling over the foot of the bed. I told myself I would not sleep. I remember blinking. That is the last clean memory before the next awakening. The lamp was off again. The room was dark except for the clock, still red, still broken in the same place, still reading 3:17. The chair was no longer under the knob. It was beside the kitchenette sink. The glass of water was on the floor, tipped on its side, the notebook beneath it swollen at the edges where the page corners had taken in moisture. My calves were screaming now, tight enough that the backs of my knees trembled when I stood. There was dust on the hem of my shirt. Not much. Enough. I did not test my fingers this time. I did not read the clock twice. I picked up the phone and pressed play on the video. The opening minutes were almost worse because they were so plain. There I was on the screen, lying flat on top of the blanket, lamp on, eyes open. A man in a small apartment making a careful little experiment to reassure himself that his own bedroom was still arranged according to the ordinary laws. After a while my chest movement slowed. My face lost whatever effort had been holding it together. At 3:11 by the file time, I sat up. Not suddenly, not violently, cleanly, like someone who had heard their name in another room. I turned my head toward the door first, then I stood. Watching myself do it felt wrong in a way I still do not have a better word for. My eyes were open on the screen, but empty of any visible decision. I crossed to the door, moved the chair aside, lifted the brass chain, and pulled the door open. I stepped out into the hall and left the apartment empty. That was the first layer, the one that locked the rest into place. I had been getting out of bed. I had been leaving the room. I had been using my body during those lucid false awakenings in ways I could not remember. Once I surfaced into the next copy of the night. The camera kept recording after I left. The apartment on the screen held still. Bed, dresser, clock. Door standing open to the strip of dim hall beyond. Nothing moved. I could hear a far elevator cable somewhere in the building, water in the pipes. The small mechanical hum from below where the laundromat dryers were still running, which meant the real room, the one on the video, still had the smell I had kept losing in the other awakenings. Then from the hall just beyond the frame I heard my own voice. If I come back in, don't let me lie down. I felt my hand close so hard around the phone that the edge cut into my palm. Because while that sentence came from the hallway, while my own voice said it from beyond the open door, something else had already changed inside the room, the blanket on the bed. When I had risen from it in the recording, I had left the top cover flat except for the long crease where my legs had been. Now, while the apartment remained otherwise empty, the center of the blanket had sunk inward gradually, unmistakably, as though weight was settling onto the mattress from above without crossing. Through the frame, I stopped breathing for a second. The dip deepened, the pillow at the head of the bed compressed by less than an inch. Then the red clock beside it rolled from 3:16 to 3:17, and the missing segment in the last digit flashed dark across the number the same way it had. In every room I had woken inside all night. The bed was still occupied. My voice answered from the hall. My voice was outside the door, and the bed was still shaped around me. The first room could be explained away. The next one could not be argued with. Story 2. There's a particular kind of silence that only exists inside a monitoring room at 3 in the morning. Not quiet. Silence. The kind that has equipment running inside it. Fans, processors, the soft mechanical breathing of instruments that never sleep. And that silence is somehow worse than actual quiet because it means everything is working exactly the way it should be. I had sat inside that silence for 4 years. I knew every frequency of it. That was why, when something changed inside it on the night of the study, I noticed before I had any conscious reason to. I had been a sleep researcher for long enough that the novelty had compressed into routine. Subjects came in, signed the consent forms, got fitted with the leads, and went to bed inside the observation room while I sat on the other side of the glass and watched their brain produce itself in colored lines on a screen. By that point in my career, I had monitored more than 300 sessions. I had seen every variation the sleeping brain produces, the dropout into slow wave, the explosive color of deep REM, the sudden brief mountain ranges of partial arousal that leave no trace in the morning. The brain at night is not restful to look at. It is busy in a way the waking brain almost never matches, working through processes that the daytime self has no vocabulary for, solving problems in a language that does not translate. I found it beautiful, in the same way that certain things are beautiful because they cannot be fully understood. The subject that night had come to us through a self-referral, not unusual. The channel for that kind of study was well known in certain online communities. People who practiced lucid dreaming seriously, kept detailed logs, had developed reliable induction techniques and wanted clinical documentation of what their brains were doing during the practice. We had run this protocol 7 times before. It was clean work. The subjects were articulate and motivated. The data was interesting. Nothing had ever produced anything I did not have a framework for. The person I was monitoring that night had been practicing for 3 years. Their logs were meticulous, time-stamped entries, duration estimates, stability ratings, descriptions of content cross-referenced by recurring elements. They had brought the logs to the intake meeting in a binder, organized by month, with a color index. The one who had referred them, a colleague who ran the online community this person had come from, told me before the session that this subject was among the most consistent practitioners they had encountered. Reliable induction, long stable episodes, high recall, no reported adverse effects. The colleague had been present for 2 of our previous studies. I trusted the referral. I remember the subject settling into the observation room with an ease that most participants did not have on a first session. The clinical environment, the leads, the monitoring bed, the camera mounted in the upper corner, the window with its one-way glass usually produced a visible tightening in first-timers. This person lay down, turned their head toward the window without being able to see me through it, and gave a single nod as if to say that they were ready. I noted it in my log as baseline calm. I noted the time as 22:47. The induction phase took longer than average, which the logs had suggested it might. This subject used a specific auditory sequence through the earbuds we had provided, combined with a breathing pattern they had developed over the 3 years of practice. I could see the effect in the readings, the slow descent through the lighter stages, the brief arrest at the threshold of deep sleep, a kind of hesitation in the line that I had seen in one previous subject, and that the literature described as the integration point, the moment when the conscious monitoring function begins to survive the drop into sleep rather than being extinguished by it. At 01:14, the subject entered REM. That was where I wanted them, and the readings looked exactly right. The characteristic electrical signature was clean and strong. The eye movements were visible through the closed lids, the rapid side-to-side and diagonal sweeps that REM produces, different from the slow rolling movements of lighter sleep. I leaned slightly toward the glass. The observation room was lit only by a low amber lamp in the corner, positioned so I could monitor the subject's visible physical state without producing enough light to interfere with the session. In that amber dim, the subject looked absolutely still except for the eyes. I noted the time at 01:14 and wrote, REM confirmed, stable entry, eye pattern consistent with onset. Then I wrote something I almost crossed out before it became part of the official record. Lips moving, not much. Just the faintest animation at the corners, the almost impression of a shape being formed repeatedly. I had seen this before in some subjects during REM. The motor suppression that prevents dreaming bodies from acting out their dreams is not. Perfectly applied, small muscle groups sometimes escape it. Lip movement during REM was documented. It was not alarming, but there was a quality to the repetition that I could not put a precise description to, even at the time. It was not the random flicker of suppressed motor activity. It was too even, too regular. I watched it for about a minute and then made a decision that I returned to many times afterward. I did not wake the subject to ask about it, and I did not note anything beyond the bare observation. Lips moving, slight, rhythmic, pattern unclear. At 01:31, the eye movements changed. They became slower, more deliberate, and then for approximately 4 seconds they stopped entirely, and then produced 3 pairs of left-right. Movements in careful succession. That pattern, the 3 deliberate left-right pairs, was the signal we had agreed on with the subject before the session. It meant I am lucid, I am aware that I am dreaming. The signal was working exactly as designed. I wrote lucid signal confirmed, 01:31. Subject conscious within REM. I watched for the secondary signal, which was supposed to follow the first after a pause. 2 slow upward movements, eyes rolling briefly upward, meaning stable, continuing. The secondary signal did not come. The readings held steady, REM still active, no sign of arousal toward waking. The subject was still in the state, but the secondary signal, which every one of our previous subjects had produced within 30 seconds of the first, was absent. I waited. At 01:34, the lip movement stopped. At 01:36, the subject moved their left hand. This was the detail that produced the first cold pressure in my chest. not because hand movement in REM was impossible. Isolated motor escapes occurred, but because of what the movement was. The hand turned palm up. The fingers curled slowly inward, one by one, in sequence as if closing around something. Then the index finger of the same hand extended and traced a shape on the inside of the opposite wrist. Once, then again, then a third time. Slow. Deliberate. The shape was the same each time. I was watching through the one-way glass in amber-lit dim, and I could not make out what the shape was. Only that it was repeated identically 3 times, which is not what a motor escape does. Motor escapes are random. Repetition requires intention. The EEG said the subject was asleep. I sat very still. Then I did what my training told me to do. I documented it. I noted the time, the hand, the movement, the repetition. I kept my observation log clinical. I did not write what I was beginning to feel, which was that I was watching a body being used in a way that the brain state visible on my screen could not account for. At 01:44, the subject's eyes opened. Not the way eyes open when a person wakes. When people wake from REM, there is almost always a preceding shift in the readings, a lightening, a transition, a visible change in the electrical state before the eyelids lift. The subject's readings showed none of that. The readings remained flat and unchanged, deep REM without any trace of arousal, and the eyes opened, wide, steady, aimed directly at the camera in the upper corner of the room. The EEG said asleep. The eyes said something else. I did not move. I am aware of how little that says about what the moment was actually like. I will only say that the instinct I had, the thing my body produced in response to what I was looking at, was not the analytical response I had. Spent 4 years cultivating in that chair. It was older than that. It was something that did not care about the readings on my screen. The subject held the gaze at the camera for 11 seconds. I counted because counting was the thing I knew how to do. At the end of the 11 seconds, the eyes closed again, and the readings continued without any indication that anything had changed. I had to make a decision about whether to enter the room. If you were sitting where I was sitting, with a screen full of data telling you the person on the other side of the glass was in a state of deep unconscious sleep, and the thing you had just watched that person do was not consistent with any documented expression of that state, would you go to the door and open it? Or would you stay in the chair where the instruments could keep telling you what was happening? Because the instruments were the only ground I had left. If I left them, I had nothing but my own senses in an amber-lit room with something that had just looked at a camera with closed eyes. I stayed in the chair for 7 more minutes and documented everything I saw. Then I went to the door. The handle was cold. I noticed that specifically because the building's temperature was controlled and the handle should have been ambient. It was cold the way a surface becomes cold when something has been pressing against the other side of it. I opened the door. The subject was lying exactly as I had last seen them. Eyes closed, hands at their sides, chest rising and falling in the even rhythm of deep sleep. The leads were all in place. The amber lamp was unchanged. The room was exactly the room I had been looking into through the glass for nearly 3 hours. I crossed to the monitoring bed and looked at the subject's left wrist, the shape the index finger had traced 3 times. The one I had not been able to make out through the glass was visible on the skin. Not a mark exactly, not a scratch. A redness, the kind that direct repeated pressure produces on soft skin over a short period of time, raised slightly, dry at the edges. The shape it formed was a word, one word. I stood over the sleeping subject and read it once, then stepped back from the bed without touching anything, and returned to the monitoring room and sat in the chair, and did not look away from the readings for the next 40 minutes until the subject's brain produced the natural transition toward waking. When I woke the subject according to protocol and asked them to describe what they had experienced, they said the lucid episode had felt short, no longer than a few minutes. They could not account for the rest of the time. They said that during the brief lucid episode, they had been in a room that was close to the observation room, but not quite right. The proportions were off, and there was no camera. They had felt the absence of the camera specifically. They said that when they tried to stabilize the lucid state, something had interrupted it, and they had lost consciousness inside the dream, which they described as unusual. Normally, losing lucid control meant a drift toward ordinary dreaming. This time it had meant nothing, a gap, no content, no sensation. I showed them their left wrist. They looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Then they looked at me. They said, "I know what that says." I said, "Can you read it from this angle?" They did not turn the wrist to look at it directly. They did not shift their position. They read it from the angle it was already at, which was not an angle from which the word was easily legible, and they said it correctly without hesitation. Then they said, "I didn't write it. I know what I documented after that. I know what the recordings showed and what the timestamps said. I know that the lucid signal appeared at 01:31 and that there was no secondary signal, and that the hand movement began at 01:36, and that the EEG never broke from deep REM, and that when I reviewed the recording and isolated the lip movement from before the lucid signal and enhanced and slowed the footage enough to read the shape the mouth was making, it was the same word that was on the wrist, being repeated before the lucid state began. The subject knew the word before looking because they had not written it during the session. The word was there before the session started, in the mouth before the lucid state, before the hand moved, before the eyes opened, already there, being rehearsed in the dark, waiting for the part of the night when the hand would be available to write it down. Whatever had been in the subject's sleeping body for those 14 minutes had arrived, knowing what it intended to leave behind. And the word it chose, the one thing it used a borrowed hand to write on borrowed skin in a room full of instruments that said nothing was awake, was not a name. It was not a warning. It was a question. One the subject said they had never thought to ask before that night and have not been able to stop asking since. A question I cannot include here because the subject is still the one who has to live inside it. What I can tell you is that the word it chose was already in the mouth before the dream began. What happened under observation still left one place to hide: doubt. The next story removes even that. Story 3. The idea started as a question we had been passing back and forth for months, not casually, but the way two people pass something between them when neither one wants to be the first to say they take it seriously. The person I had been coordinating with lived in a different time zone, which meant our correspondence always had a slight displacement to it. Messages sent in one person's night, arriving in the other person's morning, a conversation that was never quite simultaneous. We had been discussing lucid dreaming practice for long enough that we had each developed reliable technique independently, and at some point the question had shifted from theoretical to logistical. Not can two people share a dream. That was not the question. The question was whether two people, if they were precise enough, could construct a dream space so deliberately that if they both arrived there, they would know they had arrived at the same place. It sounded like a puzzle. It felt like a puzzle. That is the thing I keep returning to, how completely reasonable it seemed. Laid out in the language of method and verification and controlled conditions, two people, one constructed space, independent records before contact, a matching protocol, clean, careful, almost scientific, except that neither of us had any business calling it that. I lived alone then in a top-floor apartment in a building old enough that the radiator still knocked. I had a specific room I used for sessions. A spare room I had cleared of furniture except for a low cot and a small table with a lamp. I had painted the walls a specific gray, not because I believed it made a difference to the dream, but because having a room that felt separate from the rest of my life helped with the transition. The window in that room faced a concrete wall 6 feet away, no view, no distraction. When the lamp was off, the room was as close to total dark as I had found in that building, and the knocking of the radiator, which had annoyed me for the first year, had become a kind of anchor, a fixed auditory point that I had learned to carry down with me into the early layers of sleep. The person I was coordinating with had their own setup, their own room, their own method. We were alike in our precision, and unlike in almost every other way, which was part of why the collaboration had taken as long as it did to arrive at an actual plan. We were careful people. We did not want to contaminate the result with shared expectation. So when we finally designed the space together, we were deliberate about limiting what we shared. We agreed on a room, not a room either of us had been in. We built it from neutral components: a square space, high ceiling, wooden floor, 4 blank walls, no windows, a single source of light from above that was directionless, as if the ceiling itself produced it. We agreed on a door, one door, in the center of one specific wall. We agreed on the exact position of that door, the exact wall, the exact proportion of the room. We each spent 2 weeks visualizing this space before the session night, building it in meditation until we could walk through it in detail with our eyes open. We each recorded our independent visualizations in written form and sealed them, physical envelopes, not digital files, to be compared only after the session was complete. There was one rule, only one: nothing in the space that either of us did not put there. The session was scheduled for the same calendar date, adjusted for the time zone difference so that we would be attempting induction at the same absolute moment, 020 by my clock, which was the correct offset. We had a simple contact protocol for after: compare written records first, then call, never the reverse. The call could be influenced by conversation. The written records could not. I remember lying down in the gray room that night, with a feeling I can only describe as the particular alertness of someone who wants very much appear calm. The radiator knocked once, then settled. I had the lamp off. I had my notebook and pen on the small table within reach. I had run through the constructed space in my head 3 times during the day, walking the wooden floor, tracing the walls, fixing the ceiling light in place, standing at the door in the center of the opposite wall, and placing my hand on the handle without opening it. We had agreed we would each arrive in the room, acknowledge the door, and wait at the center of the space. If the other person arrived, we would recognize them. If they did not, we would note that and wake. The protocol was clean. Induction went the way it usually went for me by that point in my practice. A deliberate drop through the lighter layers, a conscious hold at the threshold, and then the specific quality of light that tells me, not through any sense I can name cleanly, that the state has changed. I was under for what felt like a long time before the constructed space cohered around me. When it did, it was right. That was the first thing I felt, a kind of accuracy, as if the space had assembled itself from the 2 weeks of visualization with the precision of something built rather than something dreamed. The floor was wooden, and the sound of it under my feet was the sound wood makes under pressure, not approximated but specific. The walls were exactly the proportion we had agreed on. The ceiling light was directionless in the way we had imagined, washing everything evenly without casting shadows in any direction. The room was so precisely what we had designed that I felt for a moment the clear and almost vertiginous pleasure of a hypothesis confirmed. I walked to the center and stood there the way we had agreed. I waited. The quality of waiting inside a lucid dream is different from waking waiting. It has a kind of texture to it, a resistance, as if time in that state has a slightly higher viscosity. I was aware of being aware, which is always the thing that must be maintained, and I was using some of that awareness to stay calm, because the space being accurate was already more than I had been certain would happen, and I did not want the emotional response to break the state. Then I heard the floor, not footsteps exactly. The particular compression of floorboards under distributed weight, coming from the far left of the room, about 4 feet from the wall. I turned toward it. The other person was there. I recognized them not by any physical feature of the way they appeared. The dream rendered them in the way dreams render familiar people, a composite of impression and association rather than precise visual detail, but by something underneath, appearance, a kind of quality of presence that I associated with them specifically. The certainty I felt in that recognition was not like the certainty of seeing someone's face. It was more internal than that. More like recognizing a voice before you can identify what words it is saying. We did not speak. We had not agreed to speak. We stood in the center of the space we had built together, and I felt something I had not expected, which was that the space felt inhabited in a way that 2 people alone could not quite produce. A fullness to the air of it, a sense of the room being used at capacity. I registered this and set it aside and looked at the door. The door was exactly where we had placed it, center of the far wall. Exactly the right proportion. I could see the handle, the gap beneath it, the frame against the blank wall. Then I looked at the wall to the right. There was another door, not the door we had designed. The door we had designed was directly ahead of me. This was in the wall to the right, the wall we had left blank, the wall that in 2 weeks of visualization had never contained anything. It was different from the door we had built, older looking, with a different frame, a different handle, and a gap beneath it through which no light came. I turned fully toward it, and the feeling I had been carrying since the space cohered, the pleasant accuracy of a confirmed hypothesis, went somewhere else entirely. The space had something in it we had not put there. I looked toward the other person. They were standing at the same angle I was, turned slightly away from me, and they were looking at the same wall. I could not read what their posture communicated with any certainty, only that they had gone very still, And that stillness had a quality I recognized because I felt it in myself at the same moment. Then I noticed what was in front of the door we had not built. It was not a figure. I want to be careful here because figure implies a kind of specificity that does not match what I perceived. It was a presence with an orientation. It was facing the door, not us. The door, standing close enough to the door that if the door had been opening from the other side, it would have had to push through whatever was standing there, and it was not moving. It was simply facing the door with the quality of something that had been facing it for a long time, not waiting exactly, but attending, as if the door were already doing something visible that I could not perceive from where I stood. I do not know how long I stayed in the state after that. Time in a lucid dream is unreliable under the best conditions, and these were not the best conditions. I know that I became aware of a mounting pressure, not from the presence itself, but from the accumulation of wrong things, the door, the presence, the orientation, the utter stillness of it against the room we had built with such care, and that at some point the pressure outweighed the discipline required to maintain the state, and I came up. I woke in the gray room with the radiator knocking. My notebook was in my hand. I did not remember picking it up. I wrote for 22 minutes. I wrote everything: the cohered space, the other person's arrival, the floor, the wrongness in the air, the door and the wall we had left blank, what was in front of it, the orientation, the quality of the stillness. I wrote until I was sure I had captured every detail. Then I sealed the notebook with a folded page and did not open it again until after the call. The contact protocol required written records first, so I typed my summary into a document, saved it, and sent it as an attachment with a note saying I was ready to compare when they were. Then I waited. Their summary arrived 40 minutes later. I read it before the call. I had expected partial overlap. I had hoped for it. What the protocol was designed to detect was the kind of matching that cannot be produced by shared expectation or leading conversation. The specific details, the ones we had not discussed, the ones that had no reason to be the same across two independent experiences. The space was right in both accounts. The floor, the ceiling, the proportions matched, which was expected. The other person's arrival, noted in both accounts, in different language but with the same sequence. The general accuracy of the constructed space, confirmed. Then I reached the point in their summary where the wrongness began. They described a stillness in the room they could not account for, a sense of capacity exceeded, a feeling of the space being inhabited beyond the two of them. They described the door, not our door, the other one. The one in the wall we had left blank. They described the frame, the handle, the gap at the bottom through which no light came. The description matched in every physical detail, including one I had not thought to include in my own written summary: the texture of the door itself, which they described as older than the room, not consistent with the construction, as if it belonged to a different building entirely. And then they stopped. Their summary ended at the door. The next line was a single sentence: "I need to ask you something on the call." I called them. They answered on the second ring, which meant they had been waiting. We compared the written records point by point for the first few minutes, confirming matches, noting where language differed but meaning converged. We were careful, methodical, the way careful, methodical people are when they are managing something they have not yet decided to fully look at. Then I asked about the third element. I did not describe it. I said only, there was something else in the room. Was there anything else in the room for you? The silence on the call lasted long enough that I checked my phone to see if the connection had dropped. Then they said, did it have a direction it was facing? I had not mentioned direction. In my written summary, I had described the presence in the space. I had not written anything about what it was oriented toward. I had not said anything on the call that would have given them that detail. I said, yes. They said, the door that wasn't ours. I said, yes. Another silence, shorter this time. They said, I didn't put that in my summary. I left it out because I didn't want it to be the thing that matched. I thought if it didn't come up independently, it could still just be an artifact. Something I introduced into the space without meaning to, my own material. I could live with that. I said, why couldn't it be your material? They said, because I didn't build a door in that wall. I said, neither did I. They said, I know, that's the part. We built the space together and we both know what we put in it, and neither of us put a door in that wall. So whatever was facing it was facing something neither of us made. And whatever was facing it had been there long enough that it knew where the door, was before we arrived. The call stayed open for a while after that. We did not say much. At some point, they mentioned that they had not gone back into lucid practice since the session. I said the same was true for me. Neither of us said it was a decision exactly. It had just become harder to approach the threshold with the same composure the practice required, because composure had always rested on a particular assumption, that the space you entered when you went down into that state was one you were, building one whose contents were yours and only yours, drawn from your own material. Neither of us holds that assumption anymore. If you were on that call, listening to someone read back the detail you had not written, the one you had left out because you could not live with it being real, and they confirmed it before you said it, would you go back into the practice that took you to that room, or would you let the threshold close, even knowing the room is still there, still built, still containing the door neither of you placed, and the thing that already knew where to stand in front of it? We agreed after the call to send each other our sealed notebooks, not to compare further, just to have the other person's record exist somewhere outside our own keeping. Mine arrived at their address in a padded envelope 11 days later. They confirmed it when it arrived. That was the last communication we had. I still have theirs. It sits inside a drawer in the spare room, the gray room, the room I have not used for sessions since. I have not opened it. I told myself when it arrived that I would open it when I was ready, and I have been honest enough with myself since then to understand that ready is not a state I am moving toward. The notebook is in the drawer. The room is gray, the radiator still knocks, and somewhere in the space we built together, in a wall we left blank, there is a door that did not come from either of us, and whatever was standing in front of it when we left has had a long time now. In whatever way time works inside a constructed space that two people stopped visiting, to think about whether it was waiting for the door to open, or waiting for us to come back and open it. Some things stay inside the dream. This one did not. Story 4. I painted the wall on a Thursday. I remember the day specifically because I had taken the afternoon off to do it, which was unusual for me. And the act of doing something that deliberate and that physical in the middle of a week felt almost medicinal. The room had been an off-white that had yellowed at the edges near the ceiling and around the window frame, the particular yellowing that happens in rooms that are used more than they are maintained. And I had been meaning to repaint it for 2 years. I finally bought the paint on a Wednesday, a clean flat white, and on Thursday afternoon I moved the cot to the center, covered it with a drop sheet, and spent 3 hours rolling the walls from floor to ceiling until the room was the same temperature of white in every direction. No variation, no shadow. The smell of fresh paint in a sealed room is one of the most complete smells I know. It occupies the air entirely, leaves no room for anything else. And for the duration of the painting, I did not think about anything except coverage and edges and the even pressure of the roller. When I was finished, I left the window cracked and the door open and stood in the doorway looking at what I had done. 4 walls, identical, clean, unmarked. A room that had been returned to a kind of zero. I felt, standing there with the roller still in my hand, the specific satisfaction of a surface made new. That was 8 months into the practice. I want to be careful about how I describe those 8 months because the experience of them from inside was not dramatic. It was incremental. The kind of incremental that feels like progress when you are moving through it and only reveals its actual shape when you step back far enough to see the full distance traveled. I had started with the standard techniques, the journal, the interrupted sleep, the reality checks carried deliberately through the waking day until they became reflex. I had developed reliable induction within the first 2 months, which was faster than most of the accounts I had read suggested, and I had attributed that to the consistency of my practice rather than to anything worth examining more closely. By month 4, I was sustaining lucid episodes for what felt like significant durations. The measurement of time inside a lucid dream is unreliable. The feeling of an hour can correspond to minutes of actual sleep, and the reverse is also possible. But I was developing a sense of the correspondence between felt duration and the clock time I could verify on. Waking, I kept detailed logs, duration estimates, stability ratings, content described in specific language rather than impressionistic language, because specific language forces a kind of honesty that impression allows you to avoid. By month 6, something had shifted in a way I noted in the log, but did not examine with the attention it deserved. The reality checks that I performed during the day, The habitual questioning of the immediate environment that the practice requires had become faster, more automatic. The gap between the question and the answer had compressed to the point where I was sometimes several steps past the check before I had consciously registered performing it. This felt like mastery. It felt like the skill had internalized to the degree that it no longer required deliberate attention. I wrote this in the log with something close to satisfaction. What I did not write, because I did not recognize it as a data point yet, was that the checks were becoming harder to remember after the fact. I would reach the end of a day and attempt to reconstruct which reality checks I had performed and find the record in my memory thin, approximate, lacking the specific texture of lived moments. I knew I had performed them. I could not always recall where or when or what had prompted them. I told myself this was the natural consequence of automaticity. When a skill becomes truly habitual, it leaves less of a trace in conscious memory. That is true. It is also, I understand now, a description that fits two very different processes, and I was using it to name only one of them. Month 7 brought the first bleed event. I was at a table in a place I used regularly, a small room at the back of a building I visited most weekdays, used for reading and the kind of low-level work that does not require much noise around it. I had been there for perhaps an hour when I noticed something on the wall to my left, a mark, oval, roughly about the size of a spread hand, at a height of approximately 4 feet from the floor. The color of it was a dull amber brown, the kind of mark that moisture leaves when it works through plaster from the inside and dries there, a water stain, old enough that the edges had hardened and darkened relative to the center. I had been sitting in that room most weekdays for 8 months. I knew that wall. I looked at the stain for a long moment, with the particular attention of someone trying to determine whether the thing they are seeing has been there before, and concluded that it had not, decided I had simply not noticed it, moved on. I noted it in the log that evening, not because I thought it mattered, but because I had trained myself to note sensory anomalies in the waking environment. As part of the bleed event, monitoring the practice literature recommended, the entry reads, possible bleed event, minor, noticed mark on wall in reading room. High confidence it was not there previously, resolved as unnoticed detail, continuing. 3 weeks later, I painted the wall on a Thursday. The connection between those two events did not occur to me until much later, which I think is worth noting. The impulse to paint felt like its own impulse, aesthetic, practical, overdue. I did not think of the water stain. I did not think of the reading room. I simply bought flat white paint and spent a Thursday afternoon making the room around me new. The session I am going to describe happened 11 days after the painting. I want to be precise about the timeline, because the timeline is where the only unanswerable thing lives. By month 8, the Lucid sessions had become long and detailed and consistent in a way that I had been working toward since the beginning. I was entering the state reliably, maintaining it with stability, navigating the content with a degree of intention that felt, from inside the practice, like the natural result of sustained effort. What I had not accounted for, what the literature I had been reading had, noted in passing in language I had not weighted correctly, was the relationship between the sophistication of the lucid state and the reliability of the tools used to distinguish it from waking. The reality checks that I performed inside lucid dreams had evolved alongside the practice. In early sessions, the checks had produced clear results: clocks unstable, text shifting, finger counts wrong, surfaces behaving incorrectly under touch. These were the obvious markers, the ones the guides described as reliable. But the sessions had grown more sophisticated in every direction simultaneously. The narrative coherence was higher, the sensory detail was higher, the architectural accuracy of the dream environments was higher, and the stability of the markers under the checks, the clocks, the text, the finger counts was also higher. Not perfectly stable, but stable enough that I had begun, without consciously deciding to, trusting checks that would have felt insufficient in the early months of the practice. The session began the way sessions had been beginning for several months. I went down through the threshold and the state cohered around me in the specific room I had been using for sessions: the gray room, the cot, the small table, the lamp, the window facing the concrete wall. The room I knew better than any other space I occupied, because I had been building it in the lucid state long enough that my sleeping mind had refined it to a degree of accuracy that was sometimes difficult to distinguish from the waking room. I became lucid. I performed the first check. The clock on the small table read a time that was plausible and remained stable on the second look. I touched the wall and felt the flat white paint, slightly chalky the way new paint feels before it fully cures. I counted my fingers. 5. I read the label on the lamp, looked away, looked back. Same, stable. Every marker holding. I walked the room. I noted the cot, the drop sheets still folded at the foot of it. The window cracked the way I had left it after painting. I noticed the smell of paint still faint in the air, which I found remarkable. The capacity of the lucid state to replicate not just visual but olfactory detail at that level of precision. I performed 2 more checks, both stable. I was awake. Every instrument I had developed over 8 months of practice was telling me I was awake. I turned toward the wall opposite the window. There was a stain on it, oval, roughly, the size of a spread hand, at a height of approximately 4 feet from the floor, dull amber brown at the edges, lighter at the center, the dried watermark shape of something that had come through the plaster from the inside. I stood in front of it and felt the ground shift. Not the ground beneath my feet, the ground beneath my certainty, the thing that had been holding all of it up, the checks, the stable clocks, the 5 fingers, the paint smell, the drop sheet at the foot of the cot. All of it was sitting on a foundation I suddenly could not locate. If you were standing in a room you had painted white 11 days ago, a room whose walls you had covered completely from floor to ceiling, a room you had stood in the doorway of afterward and seen as entirely unmarked, and you were looking at a stain that had no physical explanation for existing, and every single reality check available to you had just passed, and your hands looked right, and the clock looked right, and the text looked right. Would you trust the checks, or would you trust the wall? Because one of those things was telling you the truth about where you were, 8 months building the skill that was now making it impossible to know which one. I performed every check I had. Every one. I ran through the complete sequence twice. I bit the inside of my cheek and felt the specific quality of that sensation. I pressed my thumbnail into the back of my opposite hand and felt the white mark fade to pink the way it should. I read the lamp label 4 times. I counted my fingers until the counting felt absurd. Everything held, and the stain was still on the wall. I touched it. The texture under my fingertips was the texture of dried mineral deposit in old plaster, rough at the edges, slightly raised, the way water damage feels after it has fully dried. Not the smooth, flat surface of new paint. Not the wall I had made on a Thursday afternoon with a roller and 3 hours and the medicinal pleasure of coverage. This, I stood with my hand on the wall and understood something that the 8 months of practice had been quietly building toward without my recognition. The checks were designed to detect instability, a clock that shifted, text that rearranged, fingers that multiplied. They were designed for a state of dreaming that was less sophisticated than the waking world. They had never been designed for a state that had become sophisticated enough to replicate the waking world, including its stability. The checks passed inside the dream not because I was awake, but because the dream had learned the checks. I had taught it what to hold still. I came up from the state by the method I always used, closing my eyes in the session environment and falling backward with the intention of waking. And I opened my eyes in the gray room on the cot with my heart moving in the slow, heavy way it moved. When the transition was abrupt and the body was not fully ready for it, I looked immediately at the wall opposite the window, white, flat, unmarked. I sat on the edge of the cot for a long time. I wrote the session entry. I described everything, the stain, the checks, the texture under my fingers, the specific impossibility of what I had been looking at inside a room I had painted 11 days earlier. I described the location precisely, 4 feet from the floor, centered on the wall, oval, dull amber brown at the edges. Then I went to the reading room. The mark on that wall, the one I had noted 3 weeks before painting, the one I had resolved as an unnoticed detail and moved past, was still there. I stood in front of it, same height, same shape, same color at the edges relative to the center. I took a photograph. Then I went back to my log and found the entry from 3 weeks earlier and read the description I had written. The descriptions matched in every detail I had recorded: height, approximate size, color, edge quality. I had logged the reading room stain 3 weeks before I painted. I had painted 11 days ago. I had dreamed the stain on my freshly painted wall during a session this morning. I had woken to a clean wall, and the stain I had dreamed onto my clean wall was the same stain I had noted in a different room 3 weeks before the painting, in the same log, in the same handwriting, with the same measurements. I contacted the researcher whose work I had been following for most of the 8 months. I sent the log entries, the photograph, the session description, the timeline. They reviewed the material over several days and then called me. The call was long and careful, and the researcher was precise in a way I respected, which meant they did not offer me an explanation that the evidence could not support. What they said was this: the checks had been passing inside the dream because the lucid practice had developed the dream environment to a degree of sensory accuracy that exceeded the detection threshold of the tools designed to identify it. This was documented. This was a known consequence of advanced practice, noted in the literature, more common than the popular accounts suggested, underreported because the people it happened to often could not produce the kind of verifiable external evidence that would make the account useful to anyone else. The fact that I had logged the waking stain before the session in which I had dreamed it was consistent with the bleed event category, detail from the waking environment appearing in the dream state. The correspondence was real, the explanation was available. Except for one thing. The researcher said it quietly, at the end of the call, in the tone of someone who has decided to be honest at the cost of the cleaner version of what they were saying. The stain on the reading room wall, the one I had photographed, the one I had described 3 weeks before the painting, was not there when the researcher went to look at it 2 weeks after our call. Not faded, not cleaned, not there. The wall was unmarked. The building manager confirmed that the wall had not been treated or repainted in the relevant period. The stain that I had photographed, that I had logged, that I had dreamed onto my freshly painted wall before the wall had any stain on it had disappeared from the wall where I had first seen it, and the wall I had painted white 11 days before the session. The clean, flat, unmarked wall I had stood in the doorway of with the roller in my hand and felt the satisfaction of a surface made new. I went back to the room 3 days after the researcher's call. The stain was on the wall, my wall, the one I painted, at 4 feet from the floor, oval, dull amber brown at the edges, the size of a spread hand, exactly where I had dreamed it before it was there. I had dreamed a stain onto a clean wall before the stain existed. The stain then appeared on the wall, and the original stain, the one in the reading room, the one I had logged and photographed and measured 3 weeks before any of this, had gone from the wall it had been on, as if whatever had been using it as a placeholder had moved it to where it was always supposed to be, wherever the lucid sessions were taking me, whatever space I was actually inside when the state cohered around the room I thought I was building. From memory, that space already contained the wall as it would later become. The sessions were not constructed. They were not built from my own material. I was visiting somewhere that had my room in it, had known my room long enough to show me its future, and had been patient enough to wait for the waking world to catch up to what it had already shown me. I have not gone back into practice since the researcher's call. The threshold is still available to me. I can feel it in the early morning, in the narrow band between the last sleep and the first full waking, where the practiced mind knows how to hold on. I do not hold on. The wall is still stained. I have not repainted it. I think about painting it the way I think about a lot of things that would change the surface without changing what came through it. The stain arrived in a room I made new. It came from somewhere that already knew the room. And whatever that somewhere is, whatever I was actually visiting during 8 months of careful, disciplined practice descent into a space I believed I was building, it has had my room in it longer than I have. Once the waking world starts leaving proof, there is only one story left to tell. Story 5. The first thing I want to say is that I kept the record because I was worried, not alarmed, not yet. Just carrying the particular low-grade concern that settles into a person when someone they are close to begins spending significant energy on something they cannot fully see into. The practice had started quietly enough: a journal on the nightstand, a slightly adjusted sleep schedule, a specific alarm set for the middle of the night that I learned not to mention because mentioning it produced a conversation I did not have the vocabulary for yet. None of that was cause for anything beyond mild attention. People take up practices, people build routines. The notebook and the alarm and the 20 minutes of lying still in the morning before getting up were not, on their own, anything I could have pointed to and named. So I started my own record mostly to give my concern somewhere to go. Not a mirror of what they were doing, I did not read their journal, did not ask about the content of individual sessions, did not treat what I was doing as any kind of formal documentation. I bought a plain notebook, the cheap kind with the cardboard cover, and I kept it in my bag, and when something happened that felt worth noting, I noted it. Dates, small observations. The kind of thing you write down not because you believe it will matter, but because the act of writing makes the concern feel less like noise in your own head. I kept that record for 4 months. By the end of the 4 months, I had 41 entries, and I wish I had never gone back and read them in sequence, because the pattern they formed was not visible from inside the experience of living. Alongside it day by day, it only existed at the distance of the full record laid out at once. And once I had seen it, I could not see the individual entries the same way again. They had stopped being small observations and become evidence, and evidence is a different thing to carry than concern. I am going to tell you what happened from the beginning, because the beginning is where the detail is that matters, even though I did not understand it as mattering when I recorded it. The person I am talking about had been practicing lucid dreaming for about 8 months when I first noticed something I wrote down. We shared a living space, not the same room, but close enough that I was familiar with the rhythms of their nights. The alarm at 2:40 in the morning, the quiet period after it, the return to sleep, the 20 minutes of stillness before rising. I had adapted to those rhythms the way you adapt to anything that becomes ambient, not thinking about them, just knowing they were there the way you know the sound of a particular building's pipes. The first entry in my record reads, Tuesday. Found the blue mug in the cabinet above the refrigerator. Neither of us uses that cabinet. Neither of us can reach it without the step stool. Step stool was against the wall where it always is. Mug was on the second shelf behind the ceramic bowl we never use. They did not mention it when I asked. Said they had not moved it. I believed them. That is important. I believed them completely. I wrote it down not because I thought they were lying, but because the alternative was that the mug had moved on its own. And I was not prepared to sit with that, so I gave the concern a box to live in and closed the box and went on. The second entry came 9 days later. Monday, the window in the back room was latched from inside. We had not opened it since March because the frame swells in cold weather and the latch becomes difficult. Found it open this morning, latched again from inside. The latch requires 2 hands in a specific angle. They were asleep when I checked the window. The third entry came 5 days after that, and this is the one I read differently now than I did when I wrote it. Wednesday. Their journal was open on the nightstand when I brought in the morning tea. I did not read it. I am noting that I saw it was open and that the page visible was not fully filled. The last line on the visible page appeared to be 2 words. I did not read them. I wish I had read them. Not because knowing what they said would have changed what came later, but because I have spent a significant amount of time since then wondering what those 2 words were, and whether they were the same 2 words I found later in a place I was not supposed to find anything. By the 3rd month, I had 11 entries. The objects continued. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have convinced anyone who was not living alongside it and paying the particular kind of attention I was paying. The blue mug returned to the high cabinet twice more. A set of keys appeared in a coat pocket neither of us had worn in months, arranged in a specific order on the ring that differed from how they were usually kept, smallest to largest instead of the reverse. A book that had been on the shelf in the back room appeared on the kitchen table, open to a specific page, and when I looked at the page, I found a passage underlined in pencil so light it was almost invisible, and the passage was about the structure of memory during sleep, and the underlining was not in their handwriting and not in mine. I noted all of it. I kept my tone in the entries flat because flat was the only way I could manage the accumulation. Each individual entry was small enough to explain. Taken together, they were not. By month 3, I had also noticed something about their journal that I had not registered consciously until I sat with my own record and read it start to finish. The journal was always on the nightstand. I had seen it there every morning for months. But the number of times I had seen it open, the actual physical object lying open, pages visible, was much higher than I would have expected for a journal used only in morning recollection sessions. It should have been open for 20 minutes each morning and closed the rest of the time. I had seen it open at other hours, midday, late evening, once late at night, when they were already asleep and I was moving through the apartment quietly. I had seen it open on the nightstand beside the sleeping person with the bedside lamp still on, the pen uncapped and resting across the open page. I had turned off the lamp and not looked at the page. I am recording this now because I understand it as a missed moment, not because I could have done differently. There are things you do not look at because looking changes what you are allowed to know, and there are decisions in the night that feel protective that are actually just deferral. The 4th month is where the record becomes something I cannot read without my hands going still. I had begun by that point to keep a parallel log of the dates in my record alongside the dates in their journal, not the content of their entries, which I had not read, but the dates on the pages I could see when the journal was open. I noted which dates had full pages and which had partial pages, and which, on 4 occasions, I could identify clearly from the position of the pen on the page when I saw it, appeared to have nothing written at all. When I finally sat with both records side by side, mine and the date log I had kept of theirs, the correlation I found was not subtle. Every time the physical evidence appeared, the mug, the keys, the book, the underlined passage, the corresponding date in their journal showed a blank page. Not a short entry, not a few words, a blank page. And next to the blank page, on the line where the date was written, 2 words in their handwriting, no dream. I sat with that for a long time. The person I was close to was meticulous about their record. 8 months of consistent daily entries, detailed and dated, because the practice required documentation, and documentation was something they took seriously. The blank pages were not oversights. They were intentional. Someone had sat down on those mornings, opened the journal, written the date, and written 2 words to indicate the absence of content, and closed the journal. Except that on those same nights in my record, something had moved in the apartment. Something had used the step stool without disturbing it. Something had opened a latched window and latched it again from inside. Something had arranged keys smallest to largest. Something had underlined a passage in a hand that matched neither of ours. Whatever was operating on those nights had been careful enough to record its own absence in the morning. I needed to know one more thing before I decided what to do. I needed to know whether what I had found was a pattern I was constructing or a pattern that existed independently of my reading it. So I designed what I can only call a test, though I am not comfortable with how clinical that word sounds for something that felt as exposing as it felt. There was a cabinet in the back room, a small wooden cabinet, older than the rest of the furniture, that had been in the apartment when we moved in. It had a lock with a combination dial, the kind found on certain older filing cabinets and storage units, 3 digits, set by a previous tenant. Neither of us knew the combination. Neither of us had opened it. It had become the kind of object in a shared space that you stop registering because it has always been locked and you have never had a reason to open it, and so it simply exists, present and closed, part of the furniture of the place. I did not tell them about the cabinet. I did not mention the test. I simply started keeping track of whether the cabinet changed. 6 days into the observation, I arrived home in the early afternoon to find the cabinet standing open. The inside contained a single item, a shoebox, old with a rubber band around it. The rubber band had left a mark in the cardboard from long compression. Inside the shoebox was a collection of papers, not random papers, but organized ones, oldest at the back, most recent at the front. Letters, photographs, documents in a child's handwriting on ruled paper with the wide lines of early grade school, a report card. A drawing in crayon of a house with a tree and a figure in the yard and a sun in the corner with lines coming off it the way children draw suns. It took me a while to understand what I was looking at, and when I understood, I sat down on the floor of that back room and stayed there for a while. The papers were from their childhood, personal documents, the kind of thing kept in a family home for decades and eventually passed down or lost. The kind of thing that would have required someone to know the box existed, know what was in it, know the combination to get to it, and know that the person whose childhood it documented was in this apartment and not somewhere else. I looked at the report card, the drawing, the letters in the child's hand, addressed to a parent, spelling uncertain, sentences short and effortful and heartbreakingly deliberate. The handwriting. I opened my bag and took out my notebook and found the entry about the underlined passage, the underlining in a hand that matched neither of ours, and I sat on the floor and held the 2 things next to each other. The stroke angle, the pressure in the downstroke, the specific way the letters connected. The underlining in the book matched the report card, not approximately. Not in the general way that handwriting from the same person at different ages sometimes echoes itself, matched. As if the hand that had underlined that passage about memory during sleep was operating at a developmental stage decades before the person's current age, reaching through the distance between then and now with a precision that should not have been physically possible, because the muscles that produced that handwriting had not been those muscles for 30 years. If you were sitting on the floor of a back room with your own record in one hand and a child's report card in the other, and the two things were telling you that something was moving through the apartment on nights recorded as dreamless, something that knew a combination nobody living had ever been given, something that could reach a cabinet on a high shelf without disturbing the step, stool, something writing in a hand that should not exist anymore, what would you do with the person sleeping in the next room? What would you say when they came home? What would you do with the knowledge that whatever was operating was not doing harm, was not leaving destruction, was only moving objects and opening locks and underlining passages and recording its own absence, and had the hands and penmanship of a 9-year-old who believed they were writing letters that would be read? The cabinet is still in the back room. We have not discussed it. I closed it when I left the floor that afternoon, and the combination dial returned to where I had always seen it. And the next morning their journal showed a full page for the previous night, detailed and dated, a long lucid session with clear recall. Nothing absent. I have not gone back to look at whether the cabinet was opened again on a blank page night. I already know the answer. What I do not know, what I have no floor beneath, is whether the thing moving through this apartment on those recorded as dreamless nights believes it is still 9 years old, whether it has ever understood that the letters in the shoebox were never sent, whether it goes to the cabinet on those nights because the cabinet is where the evidence lives that it existed before the person sleeping in the next room became the person I know, or because something in that childhood learned to find its way back to a room it recognizes even though the room is 40 years and 1,000 miles from where that child sat at a table and gripped a pencil with too much pressure and wrote words down with the effortful care of someone who has not yet learned that writing is supposed to feel easy. The stories end here. The part you need to hear does not. Before you go, there is one thing about lucid dreaming that the practice guides mention and then move past quickly, because it does not fit cleanly inside the framework of skill and technique and controlled experience that makes the practice appealing. The part they move past is this. The brain cannot reliably distinguish between a memory of something that happened and a memory of something that was dreamed, not in the moment of recollection, not without external verification. The same neural architecture that encodes waking experience encodes dream experience, and the process of consolidation, the nightly transfer of experience into long-term storage, does not sort reliably between the two categories. It consolidates what it has. Waking and dreamed material enter the same archive, filed under the same system, retrievable through the same mechanism. For most people, this produces small confusions. A dream that felt real for a day or two, a memory that turns out to have no external confirmation, manageable errors in an otherwise stable system. For people who practice lucid dreaming, who spend months training the brain to be conscious and intentional and observant during the dream state, who make the dream environment as detailed and coherent and sensorially accurate as the waking world, the archive receives material that is increasingly difficult to classify at the point of input. The brain consolidates it anyway. It has no other option. It files it. What this means practically for anyone who has practiced long enough and consistently enough is not a question about last night's dream. It is a question about everything further back than that. Every memory that was consolidated during a period of advanced practice. Every recollection from those months that has no external verification attached to it. Every moment you remember clearly, specifically, with full sensory detail, from a period when your sleeping mind was producing experiences your waking mind could not distinguish from real ones. The archive does not flag the entries it is uncertain about. It simply returns them when asked, with the same confidence it returns everything else, and leaves you to determine, after the fact, without access to the original experience, using only what the memory itself contains, whether what you are remembering happened in a room you were awake in, or a room you only believed you were awake in. because you had spent months building exactly that belief. You have always trusted your memory of ordinary moments. The practice does not take that trust away. It simply gives you a reason for the first time to wonder what the ordinary moments were made of. Do not let that feeling go yet. If any part of what you heard tonight put you somewhere you did not expect to be, tell me in the comments, not what you think happened, where you were when it landed, what you were doing, what the room around you felt like at that moment. Those responses are the ones worth reading. Subscribe if you want the next one. Turn on notifications because the next video will not announce itself gently. And if this reached you, tap the like. It helps the next person who needs to find this channel before they understand why.